All right, yes, thanks everyone again for being here, especially Roshi Joan, our honored speaker today. So Roshi Joan Halifax, PhD, is a pioneer in end-of-life care, a Zen Buddhist teacher, and an activist. Along with psychiatrist Stanislav Grof, she co-led the psychedelic trials for terminally ill patients as part of the famous Spring Grove experiments in the 1970s. She and Grof documented the experience in the preeminent book, The Human Encounter with Death. Roshi Joan currently serves as the founder and head teacher at the Upaya Zen Center in Santa Fe and continues to serve dying people, their families, and health professionals in the care of the dying. She has authored several books and has founded multiple clinics and foundations around the world, including the Upaya Prison Project, which teaches meditation to prisoners. Today, she will be speaking to us about her work with Dr. Grof on LSD-assisted psychotherapy for the dying, with some time for questions at the end, although she does have to get off right at 1. So we'll try to honor that. Without further ado, Dr. Roshi Joan Halifax.
Thank you, Rebecca. So I'm very happy to be here today to share a little bit about this early work using LSD as an adjunct to psychotherapy. Just a little bit of background. My training was first in cross-cultural and then medical anthropology. And before working with Stan, I was a medical anthropologist at the University of Miami School of Medicine in the departments of psychiatry and pediatrics. And I worked all over the medical system as a consultant, and also was, very involved in training medical students about culturally determined illnesses and so forth. So in any case, on a personal note, Grof and I married in 1972. And it seemed pretty logical, me moving from Florida up to Maryland, that I joined the Maryland Psychiatric Research Project. That project was under the directorship of Albert Kurland. Walter Punke, who was probably the best known of the psychiatrists who worked at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center, died in a swimming accident. And Stan, who was Czechoslovakian, brought himself and all of his records of the LSD work he'd done in Czechoslovakia to the United States, and didn't return because of the invasion of Czechoslovakia by Russia. And Stan eventually took over as the sort of head of research at Maryland Psychiatric Research Center. And just to make a note, at the research center, well, I actually want to say something about Czechoslovakia. Stan was a psychiatrist, but also a psychoanalyst. And he developed, because Albert Hofmann had sent him some samples of LSD, he found them really interesting. And he ended up administering LSD not only to his psychiatric patients, but to almost every artist who lived in Prague, and to a number of the psychiatrists in Prague. So when I went back to Prague on his behalf, because he couldn't go back in 1972, it was really pretty extraordinary to see the effects on certain aspects of the culture of that beautiful city. It was quite inspiring. In any case, at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center, LSD was used as an adjunct to psychotherapy with people who had problems, issues with addiction. Also, a number of therapists and clergy went through the experience. And then there was the work with dying people. And because of the work that I did at the University of Miami in the end-of-life care field, Stan and I then collaborated on this work with dying cancer patients. And it was a very powerful endeavor. As many of you can imagine, it was under the aegis of the National Institute of Mental Health. It, was not done in a casual way. There were certain criteria that were quite strict in terms of people being referred into the project. The intensive preparation of the patients with whom we worked was notable, and also the very intensive process that we entered into with the patient and their families post-session is also notable. And the feeling in that simulated living room in the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center, where the sessions took place, and the sessions, by the way, lasted, we were probably with a patient close to 18 hours in a day, in the session day. I remember we were giving a lecture in Hawaii, and physicians were like, forget that. Who spends 18 hours with a patient? Well, maybe certain surgeons do, but it didn't seem time efficient, to some of the clinicians that were in the audience. But in any case, the sort of set and setting were very important to how this process unfolded. I can say, as someone who was partnering with Stan, that the sense of the sacredness or the respect for the human unconscious as it was evoked in these sessions was really profound. And I think it was one of the key elements in our approach and the success that we had in working with these dying people. So the sense of recognizing that this experience was a rite of passage, and that we approached it as sacred work, and that we had a kind of attitude toward the patient's family, and the clinicians who were related to the patients, which was characterized by a lot of gravity. So I want to emphasize that because I feel it's really important. It's, Stan and I, in this book that we wrote, The Human Encounter with Death, we continued to emphasize throughout the book the importance of set, the view, how you approach things, and also of setting, of having an environment which was not clinical in feeling, which was, had sacred objects about that the patient chose herself, himself, themselves, that the music that was used in the course of the session was carefully curated with the patient so that we weren't offending the patient's sensibilities. Also, we worked with people of all ages and all races and all SES, socioeconomic statuses. So our capacity to adapt psychologically and socially to each individual was also critical in, I believe, the effectiveness of what we did. And I think another thing had to do with having two therapists in the room who respected each other, who had done very deep work themselves, Stan and I, using psychedelics. And one of the things about the Maryland Psychiatric Research Project is that everybody who facilitated directly or co-facilitated sessions went through the process with a skilled facilitator, usually either Bill Richards or Stan and me, in terms of them familiarizing themselves with this territory. And what we discovered is that one session really, this high dose LSD experience that was 600 micrograms. So this is different than MDMA and psilocybin and ayahuasca. This is a single overwhelming dose. But sometimes we realize that people unearthed surfaced experiences which required more therapy and more integration, and qualifying them to be able to sit with people who are going through this depth of experience. So I think you should read the book. I think the book is good. even though it was written in the mid-70s. I see on, some academic site I'm on that it's probably my most read article. And it's probably a bit of a collector's item. But what I'd like to do is and I'm just I'd like to go over some things that I think are important. If you're considering to, engage in this work in a way that's characterized by, a lot of ethics, sensitivity, and integrity. And as I've already mentioned, I believe that we have deeply underestimated the human unconscious. I can say I did until I engaged in, the preparation for being a co-therapist. That the range of experiences that I myself went through had, great benefit in me being able to accept some of the unusual experiences that our patients went through. And it wasn't a matter of just coming alongside. It was really a matter of having the kind of psychic openness that was non-judgmental, but also there's some other quality, I can't quite put words to it, but it might be really caring about even experiences, that might seem to other people weird or even disgusting. Yeah, so that is one piece I just want to keep emphasizing, is how important it is that the so-called therapists, people are taking these programs. I'm just kind of surprised to become a psychedelic therapist, a little bit on every street corner or every, institution. And I just know from this experience that I had at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center that the depth of the experience of the people that we were working with was such that it took a lot of skill to actually work with these individuals in terms of what they were experiencing somatically, what they were experiencing also affectively, a whole range. Stan has written a lot about varieties of transpersonal experiences. There's a whole sort of realm of mystical experiences that, people encounter. I remember I had a conversation with Kalina Christoph, who's done some work on brain mapping around psilocybin, and she's very excited. She showed me the scans and everything was like lit up. And I said, if you're normal, everything's not going to be lit up. You have to actually, in order for us to navigate in the world, you don't want everything lit up. You want to have actually a coherent sort of neural field. And so this was, one of the things is like somehow the idea that everything being lit up was good. Well, we have our defenses for a reason. And I think that the work being done in neuroscience and mapping some of these states is interesting, but it has to be, understood not just in terms of, volume of activity, but also what that activity produces in the individual. And also how individuals, after that kind of activation experience, how they integrate that into their everyday lives. Another piece that I was very aware of, because Stan had, this whole sort of model of the basic perinatal matrices and also the COEX system, so the BPM system that he had, of course, was related to individuals reliving their biological birth. So I'm not going to go into detail on this, I could, but it was very interesting. But I kind of felt also in terms of the COEX systems, these systems that Stan had in varieties of transpersonal experiences, those models that Stan had, I believe at the preconscious level, influenced the experience of our patients. In other words, we sort of anticipated certain things happening because that's what, kind of was our view. And so it is very interesting, I think, and maybe useful to actually explore how a therapist or psychiatrist or sitter, what their views are in, what they're anticipating their patients will go through. I think that's not inconsequential, but it's subtle. I think another thing has to do with the substances themselves, and that is that, different plants activate different areas of the brain and produce different kinds of experiences. Peyote can be more active and engaged. Mushrooms can be more passive. Ketamine can produce dissociative experiences. Ayahuasca, the alkaloids were originally called telepathine, and they're very interesting. And can work, in terms of a sort of group experience and so forth. And I think it's useful to know, or MDMA, which is really an empathogen, that, different substances, it just are useful for different situations, different people. In other words, mushrooms are not always psilocybin what will serve. It might be, MDMA. It might be ketamine. It could be ayahuasca. It could be an experience in a group context, and so forth. Another issue, and I say this from the point of view of my background in anthropology, is to understand the profundity of these experiences in the lives of people, and that it is probably important for us to consider that these experiences could be characterized as a contemporary rite of passage, that they can produce, profound phase shifts in how people perceive the world, their worldview, and how they conduct their lives, what their values are, and so forth. And this was, I think, very clear to us in working with dying people. I remember one patient, his name was Dean, wonderful Afro-American man, who had a, extraordinary, experience with us, seemed extraordinary. And his family came in, at 10 or 11 at night, all these wonderful people. And we were together praying, and it was beautiful. And he was diagnosed with terminal colon cancer. And about a month later, he was rehospitalized and was delirious. And his organs were beginning to shut down. And Stan and I were by his bedside with all of his family members, and whoosh, they grabbed Dean and off he went. And his life got saved, and he came back. He was really not happy. And he wasn't happy because he had accepted his death. And he had this, phenomenal LSD experience, and had really come to terms with his own mortality. And he felt like death was beautiful, and he was ready, and his life had been saved. It was kind of an interesting moment in our experience with patients. I remember also Dr. Schaefer, who referred patients to us over the time that we were working together at the research center. And then he developed pancreatic cancer. And he asked us to actually come to his home and do the LSD session in his home. And he's a wonderful doctor with a really amazingly supportive wife. He also was a musician, and at times he conducted the Baltimore Philharmonic. And so, the music was very important to him. And he also had, a life-changing and death-affirming experience. And when he was admitted into the hospital where he practiced, Johns Hopkins, in his sort of the final phase of his life, they actually provided a double bed for him to be in. So not only his wife, but the nurses could hold him as he was in this dying process. So, these experiences were, really very inspiring to me, as you can imagine. But I think that it's interesting to explore whether you're viewing the intervention per se as a rite of passage or as a therapeutic intervention. One of the things that is really critical in this work is the integration of the experience back into the family and into, the individual's world, their work world, their social life, and so forth. The kinds of experiences that people go through are so uncommon or abnormal in our culture that when a person talks about it with their family members or friends, they're just not well understood. Or if there's a dramatic values shift, they're not well understood. And so I look at it's a sort of personal responsibility of the therapist, whatever they're being called now, to actually facilitate the integration, not just in the individual, but into the context of their lived experience. There are issues, and I, if you don't mind, I'll just address some of these issues, and then I'd be very happy to take any questions. I think that there's some challenges that have to be, or issues that have to be examined in relation to so-called psychedelic tourism and the problematic effects on indigenous peoples and their lands. There are issues related to cultural appropriation, which have to do with the unacknowledged or inappropriate adoption of customs or practices or ideas of one people or of a group of people or of a society by members of another group, particularly a more dominant group. So, the issue of psychedelic tourism or of sort of pseudo-shamanism is something I think that has to be considered in all this. But I think we can learn a lot about the use of entheogens or psychedelics from indigenous peoples in the right circumstances. Another issue that I think is critical to look at has to do with the commodification of this process and really of understanding the experience of converting a human social or cultural value into market value. And this is applied, to lots of different things, services, ideas, goods, products, but also to, the experience of working with plant medicines. And to understand that the issues related to the commodification of this sacred process. And for me, it is sacred. It's is something that is important to keep in mind. And this also includes the medicalization of this process. I'm not very popular, I have to say, for bringing up these issues, but I just want to bring them up to you. And this is, issues related to medicalization refer to the process in which conditions and behaviors are labeled and treated as medical issues. And the medical, industry, if you will, have made enormous profits over the very, process of transformation, of psychological transformation that people go through for better or for worse. And this also applies to the pharmaceutical companies who are controlling and profiting from these mind manifesting substance. So there's some things that I think are really, critical for a principled institution or individual to consider, when engaging in this process. And there are issues also that come up around sitters or therapists who are not well trained, and individuals who get into a lot of psychological problems, encounter a lot of psychological problems after sessions that are not attended to. And so I think one of the questions is, how do you train in a principled way for this work? And of course, my opinion, having been one of the early sitters or co-therapists, is it's not easy. I was glad I was an anthropologist. I was glad I had been through psychoanalysis and lots of other therapy. I'd also, as a young person I'm 80 years old, by the way. So I was in my 20s in the 1960s. So I'd had, my share of psychedelic experiences, including in the field as an anthropologist. So I was glad I had that under my belt to give me a perspective that I felt kept me grounded in the relationship I had with our patients. And as I said, we have our psychological defenses for a reason. And these substances lower those defenses for the most part. And so as a result of that, people can have experiences which are terrifying, disturbing, difficult to integrate, and can have
still coming into town.
Can have a long-term effect on their lives. So maybe I've said enough. Hold on one second. So I'm just trying to get hold of, someone's trying to get hold of me about a thing. Hang on one second and just see. Okay, thank you. So what I'd like to do is I'd love you to ask me tough questions and maybe I'll have some disappointing answers for you. Okay, Surya.
Thanks, Joan. Can you hear me okay?
I can.
Thanks so much for sharing your rich experience and wisdom here. I realize it might be a kind of a big topic, but my question is really about the relationship between contemplative practices and the psychedelic work, specifically kind of the directionality, both backwards and forwards or back and forth between these two worlds. What can you share with us about your view on that relationship?
Well, that's an interesting question. I remember Roland years ago asked me, he started this project, the project in the East Bay of Hopkins. He asked me about, if I was willing, but I wasn't, to actually be recruited into these advanced meditators having the psychedelic experience. And I said to Roland, well, first of all, it's kind of interesting. I mean, I've done a lot in that world. I've sort of graduated, so to speak. But I said, you're going to have an interesting time recruiting people to actually take psychedelics, because the fifth precept that one takes as a Buddhist practitioner disallows, one engaging in taking substances like this, whether it's alcohol or anything else. Well, I think Roland, was probably somewhat successful in his endeavor. So that's one thing I want to mention. But the other thing I want to mention is that in terms of my own personal experience, two things. You can imagine well, you probably can't imagine what it was like being married to Stan. Before I married Stan, I began my own meditation practice in 1965. So I was very happy to have meditation as an experience for many reasons, not the least of which it gave me a metacognitive experience or perspective, being able to look at things more objectively when I was in the midst of really, outrageous psychological experiences. And it also facilitated the integration of these experiences. So I think that, the interaction between these two, is positive. I think that also the second piece for me has to do with at a certain point, I graduated from taking psychedelics, and I really had to work hard through contemplative practice to restabilize myself. The disruption to my own mental continuum had been pretty dramatic. And so contemplative practice has been, a force in my life to foster a lot of attentional stability, which wasn't there because of you could say, the gating process that makes it possible for us to operate in the world was very disrupted because of psychedelics. What do you think of that? Surya?
Well, I feel like, maybe this could be a whole nother talk or someone could write a book on this. I do hear in the community people applying, kind of mixing the two. Of course, there are traditions that would prohibit that and don't want anything to do with that. But there is this natural phenomenology of exchange between the two sides. It sounds like you wouldn't be opposed to that skillful combination in principle.
Well, I have, my good friend Vanya Palmers. I don't know if you've seen the wonderful film about his place Felsentor in Switzerland, where he's a Zen practitioner, an ordained priest from San Francisco Zen Center. But he's kind of a wild hair of a guy. He's the person who funded the psychedelic work with cancer patients in Switzerland. And Vanya administers mushrooms in his Zendo, and there's a fascinating film of it. I thought it was so well done, where, they're his Dharma students, nice, upstanding Swiss folk, walk up to the altar, pick up the mushrooms, ingest the mushrooms, bow, offer incense, then go and face the wall. So I was like, Vanya, that is really wild. And that's not what I would do. But anyway, and then, of course, one of his students starts having a very intense experience and, has to lay down and is being attended to by others. I mean, all kinds of stuff is happening today. So I just sit here as a grandmother of the field and look on it with amusement, surprise, wonder, delight, and dismay. You all might want to look at the film. I've forgotten the name of it, but anyway, maybe someone can put it in the chat if someone knows the name. Anything else, Surya?
Well, yeah. I guess you spoke of graduating from psychedelic experience. Can you say some more about that? What does that look like? What does that feel like? Is it something we should think about in designing therapeutic programs with psychedelics, that there's a ceiling or a roof?
I think that renunciation, in the sense of graduation, so to speak, or renunciation is not something that's done from a top-down way. I just simply wanted to get clear. I wanted to see things clearly. I didn't need any more fantastic experiences. I just became disinterested in the sort of mind-altering, mind-expanded states. It just dropped away, kind of like if I never smoked cigarettes, but, if you were smoking cigarettes and one day they did taste good to you and you stopped. So that's kind of how I graduated. Wasn't interested anymore.
Is that a common experience amongst folks who are very experienced with psychedelics that you've seen?
Yeah, I think all sort of my generation, Gary Snyder, Allen Ginsberg, my whole generation, and those a little bit older than I who entered, into the psychedelic world in the 1960s. Ram Dass too, RD, who was my good friend and who died just a few years ago, just wasn't interested in those states. I think there's some kind of really beneficial transformation that happens with deep and intensive experiences of this kind, and they shift your values, and the values say you don't need to do that anymore. You graduated. You got it. You got the message.
I don't want to dominate the questioning here. Oh, there's someone else who has their hand up.
Okay, well, if you have any more, we have a few more minutes. Lida.
Yeah, hi, Doc. Thank you. It's Lida. You were absolutely right the first time. Thank you for your work. Thank you for the beautiful experience sharing that you did, and thank you for all the warnings. I'm a big believer in all of what you said. I see a lot of, and I've been in this work for the past 10 years, and I see that happening, where people are going to South American countries and we don't really know how legitimate these retreats are, and I've seen people come back harmed for a long time. So I think those points that you made towards the end of your presentation are very well taken, and we absolutely need to approach this realm with very conscious awareness of what it can do positively and also negatively, and how if our vision of our world is to go somewhere positive, then how can we employ the things that we've learned from your work and, giants like you in the field? Of how can we veer it towards that more positive projection? You brought up the role of therapists, and I believe in Oregon now, therapists are able to give psilocybin as a part of their therapy. How would you, if you were to, train, and I know this is like a very gray area, not only does the individual need to have the education, but also the personal experience. How would you approach the integration part of how do you teach people how to integrate? And there may be a book, there may be, I don't know if there's anything out there to look at or provide, but how would you direct people?
I think one of the really critical things has to do with the kind of respect that a therapist manifests in relation to the experience of the individual. And this respect would actualize not just in terms of the day of, but also, threading with that person through the experience of their return to their so-called normal life and the effects, as I said, on their family and perhaps their colleagues and friends and so forth. But I also want to say this is a very subtle dimension, and it's going to sound kind of woo-woo, but who the therapist is makes a difference in the person's, in the patient's experience. So, the deeper the work the therapist has done on themselves, and it's, I know this, in terms of practice, when I sit with a student in a doksan, in a private interview, in my better moments, the student can sense into my practice, my realization. And that has a very subtle but determining effect on the experience of the patient. And so that's why, just training up a bunch of sitters, to me is just like, wow, because of the depth of experience that people have in these states, and also that the psychosocial obligation to facilitate a healthy, sensitive integration of that experience for the individual. And so it's not like, you come in for your session day. Like, I have a very good friend who's a palliative care physician who went through the whole COVID thing. She didn't have COVID. She just attended the deaths of hundreds of people and had unbearable grief. She had, I think, 9 ketamine sessions, and nothing happened in those sessions for her. And, I began to dig a little bit, and what I realized was the therapist had, not much of a connection with her, didn't really care. She was just administering the infusion. So I only know, again, from my experience of working with dying people and with Stan, we were so motivated to do this right. And Stan and I, probably me too, high integrity, caring people. We wanted the best for the people that we worked with. This wasn't an LSD mill. And, we sat at the bedside of some of our patients at the moment of their death. We were there. And we supported their families in their grief. It wasn't like one stop, it was kind of stopping in and getting your jollies in Alpendor. It was a sacred trust for us. And, that's how we approached it. And I think whatever success we had was based on that kind of holding of the space internally and interpersonally that we engaged in.
That's beautiful. Thank you. And it is sacred. Absolutely.
Thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Larry.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your talk, Joan. I have a question about the nature of the transformation that can happen with people that are in serious illness and near death. One way of approaching this is some people that experience a near-death experience, and from the near-death experience appreciate some calmness, a different attitude. They're transformed in how they're approaching this. Other times, I think it's a question of reaching more of a mystical experience of connectedness, and I know those are subtle differences, but I just want to know, with all your experience with this, what you see as the role of the near-death experience in helping people work through their serious illness.
I did a whole presentation on this for the Dalai Lama in 1992. It's in a book edited by Francisco Varela. I've forgotten. Might have been called Gentle Bridges or Sleeping, Dreaming, and Dying. I don't remember which book it was. So, Larry, I think that the potential for people going through this experience, a death and rebirth experience, but know the death side of the equation is more common than it's not just you're sitting there having a good time and boof, all the beauty happens. A transpersonal moment. Often there's quite a struggle before and collapse. And sometimes individuals get stuck on the heavy end of the continuum and, look at death as just abhorrent and terrifying. And then, in the best of all possible worlds, and it's frequent, there is this kind of opening of, bliss and so forth. So I think there's great potential for that. And I think that potential is alchemized when one has gone through that experience oneself. So that when the sort of death part of the equation's happening, there's the kind of support coming alongside and confidence that on the other side of that is liberation. The thing about the unconscious, or, releasing all of this kind of deep content from within the human unconscious, is everything is there. The beautiful and the ugly. So, it's not all fun. I mean, people go through, horrible experiences of dismemberment, torture, and, all kinds of really creepy, scary stuff. Bad forces entering them, and, stuff that's really heavy. And you just, hope there's enough juice left in the session to get on the other side of that. And Stan and I used to say, and it's kind of weird, we used to say a bad trip is a good trip. Because, generally the experience of breakthrough from this very negative content in the psyche, produced, insights and some kind of openness to reality that was, really extraordinary.
Yeah, I really appreciate that perspective. Sometimes I've seen helping guide someone to go towards the fear, towards that is actually their most powerful way they can heal through it. Thank you so much for answering that. Appreciate it.
So we have 2 more minutes. I'm happy to spend those with you if you have any other questions.
I was specifically kind of wondering about working with psychedelics as a contemplative practice. I know there's a lot of words and research and literature trying to define that set of contemplative practice, but I haven't really heard anybody talking about psychedelic work as a contemplative practice. And at the same time, I know a lot of people are microdosing, like on a daily basis over long periods of time. Do you have what are your thoughts about that direction?
Yeah, I actually don't know anything about microdosing because I've only macrodosed. And unlike Vanya, I cannot imagine doing zazen, honestly, on acid, but I'm sure people have. That's just not, I'm not constitutionally prepared to do that. But again, this is a powerful tool. So I just want to say, this is a powerful tool with incredible potential for positive transformation in an individual's life and in the life of our society. And if it also anything that is as powerful as the use of entheogens in the whole range of entheogens there are, every stick is two ends. And so the downside is important to consider and to endeavor to mitigate as to support the upside. Well, wonderful. Thank you all. I'd love you to stay in touch. Also, I'm happy to, to think out loud with you on another occasion if that should serve.
Thank you, Roshi, Joan, so much for being here and for the work that you do. I think that I probably speak for all of us here when I say that you are an inspiration, and we deeply appreciate your time and your perspective.
Wonderful. Good luck on the road ahead.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.